some of you might be wondering why at an event that's, a P&G investment conference, we are focusing on the rest of the Pacific or the Pacific as a whole. But there's no doubt that most of the people that are at this event, if you're doing business in P&G or you're interested in doing business in P&G, you probably have some interest in the rest of the region, or if you haven't, you probably should be considering it. For example, the business links between P&G and the Solomon Islands are particularly pronounced, and I know there's one or two people in this room who certainly have investments in both jurisdictions. So what we're looking to do this morning is to give you as much information on what's happening in the region as possible in as short a time as possible. And we've got three expert panelists here to provide their comments. Now, first of all, since we last met in person in 2019, something that has probably the biggest change in the Pacific, apart from, I guess, the impact of COVID, is the geopolitics. Things really have changed remarkably, and that's something that the business community can't ignore. Even in our small way, it's something that, from the point of view of Business Advantage International, it's something we're aware of. We're a small business, but we're certainly very aware of that. So I'm very pleased that our first speaker this morning is Mihai Sora, who is the project director for the Australia P&G network at the Lowy Institute. He's one of the foremost experts on the geopolitics of the Pacific, regularly cited in the Australian mainstream media. Welcome very much, Mihai. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks, Rob.
Okay, so what I'm going to ask you, first of all, is maybe just as an introduction, things have changed dramatically. I don't think the Pacific has ever been in the Australian media as much as it's been in the last few months. What does that mean for businesses that are doing business in the Pacific already, or who are considering it?
So what it shows is that the Pacific is now well and truly part of that geopolitical contest for influence among the larger powers. So primarily the US and China are vying for strategic, economic, and political influence in different arenas in the globe. We saw from, I would say, the end of last year, a real uptick in that in the Pacific region. And it happened to coincide with Australia's federal election in May as well. And so it really got wrapped up into that debate. What it means for businesses is that they need to be aware of these global dynamics and how they manifest in our region. There's a certain degree of unpredictability, but there's also a lot of opportunity. That renewed interest comes with renewed resources, both in personnel and access to funds, a renewed attention and an effort to better understand the region from traditional partners, the US, the EU, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and efforts to be better connected to the region. So obviously government can change policy settings, but it does need business to come along and implement those sorts of activities.
Okay, and specifically, let's just talk about the risks to business, because I guess that's probably what they're thinking about first. How do you think their thinking should have changed in the last, let's say, 12 months in terms of how they engage with the region?
I think the risks are if there are unintended consequences, or part of it is about optics and not wanting to be co-opted into someone's narrative. The risk is for a business is to be seen to be partisan one way or another, or to have their opportunities sort of become entangled. A lot of businesses in the Pacific, they have presences in a number of countries around the world. So if they're thinking, what are the political risks for me? How do I manage that? My answer would be, set a good example. And if you're delivering something to the market that you're focused on, delivering something that also generates a social good, if you have local relationships, you can sort of navigate between these political forces.
Thank you. And of course, at the same time, this new reality does seem to also bring potential opportunities for business. Generally, the amounts of dollars that are being proposed to be spent in the region by Australia and others is unprecedented, I would say. Where do you think there might be opportunities in the next year or two or three for international companies to actually benefit from the renewed focus on that region?
Sure. So we have touched on a lot of the themes over the course of the conference already in terms of the sectors. I would say the starting point would be to identify your location, your country, or your part of the region, and work backwards from the problems or the needs that you see there. Just the same old basic business principles. And I think, in terms of the government's engagement with those issues, there's an effort to better align what the Australian government, for example, can provide through the development program, or other financing facilities, partnerships with the US and the EU and Japan, to better align those with what businesses can produce and can offer. So really, it's about finding partnerships, and the sectors that we know, minerals, infrastructure, climate change, and ways to adapt and mitigate to that. But really, we don't want to lose sight of traditional sectors of engagement. So health and education. Often, if you focus too much on geopolitics, you go straight for the large infrastructure projects, and that's where the big bucks are. But development needs, contribute directly to prosperity, and prosperity contributes directly to global security, to regional security as well. So, there's a real understanding that these things are connected. So if you're a business in any sector, I would say that, there's a need for connectivity, there's a need for better delivery of social services, and of course, renewable energies, being able to produce that. So, as I said earlier, government can identify these spaces, but it does need to partner with actors that can, deliver in a practical way.
And just in terms of what you're expecting, there's been a lot of talk in the media about increased spending in the region by this or that, entity. But what are you genuinely expecting in terms of, what actually happens in the next year or two in terms of those dollars that actually get spent, and in terms of new projects and opportunities that creates? Can you maybe just give us some kind of insight?
Well, where the source of that funding is government, they'd be looking for reliable partners, trusted partners, and they would expect those partners to in turn have relationships in the countries they're looking to operate in. They'd be expecting those partners to meet particular standards, so there's no reputational risk, but also so that genuine, goods are being delivered, social goods, and
Yeah. Okay, and just let's just focus on the Solomons, because that has been the country perhaps most in the news this year. What would your message be? And we are going to talk to Adrian about for a market update of the Solomons very shortly. But in terms of the geopolitical situation, what would your message be to people looking to do business specifically in the Solomons, who may have read these headlines about maybe the tension with Australia and maybe their current foreign policy?
Look, I would expect that the Solomons will be a focal point for countries looking at the region through that political lens. And what that means is that's opportunity for business. So, I really don't want to leave the audience with the impression that businesses or individual countries in the Pacific would or should be put in a position where they have to choose what sort of affiliation they have. I think, countries like the Solomons and other countries in the Pacific, they can benefit from this increased attention. We're looking for more engagement with countries like the Solomons, not as a way to sort of carve it up or to carve up the Pacific along any kind of geopolitical fault line, but looking for opportunities to partner across those fault lines. And really, the story of doing business in the Pacific is about engaging in a positive way with the region. That's the story that we should have. And there are opportunities to partner across nationalities, if you will. You know, businesses, particularly larger projects, will rely on many stakeholders and sources for materials and personnel and expertise and so on. And I think that story applies to the Solomons and applies to other countries in the Pacific as well.
Okay, well, this conference is aiming to promote PNG, and I guess by extension the Pacific, to the wider international business community. I make that point because it's not a bilateral event. Having said that, Australia is still the biggest donor to the Pacific and the region. So what I'd like to do now, I'm just going to read a couple of quotes from an article you published in the Financial Review on the 1st of April, and then I'm going to see what you think about those issues now that we have a new Australian government. So what you wrote on the 1st of April were comments such as, Australia demonstrates leadership in the region by being the largest aid donor and primary guarantor of security. But for Pacific countries, and I jump ahead, but for Pacific countries to transition to economic independence, Australia should pursue opportunities for greater economic integration with the region. And the kind of examples you gave were rethinking migration, education, regional economic integration, which would have huge payoffs for Australia and the Pacific. So let's fast forward nearly, 5 months. We've got a new government in Canberra. What are you expecting on those issues in the next year or two?
Look, the new government in Australia came out very strong on the Pacific. They engaged as quickly as they could with the region. We saw Foreign Minister Penny Wong travel to the Pacific. She's had multiple trips there. We see this focus on people-to-people links, and we can unpack that, and we can talk about access to migration. So the government's looking to introduce a Pacific visa class where we see up to 3,000 places per year reserved for people from Pacific Islands. The allocation of that is still being worked out, but you know, if you look at a pro rata sort of way of looking at it, Papua New Guinea would be expected to benefit the most because it's the largest country. So that's that migration piece, that people-to-people links, and I think that really delivers opportunities for businesses as well. You know, in terms of looking to partner with the right local stakeholders and to both access and build the skills that you need for your business to be successful. We see the other aspect of Australia's foreign policy to the Pacific right now is engaging with the issue of climate change in a more constructive way, seeking to offer at a political level more of what Pacific countries expect from Australia, from Australia's position to be on climate change. So technology has to be a part of that. Delivering programs has to be a part of that. So again, you know, it's an effort to deepen the link, so it's not just a political relationship or a development cooperation relationship, but to connect with day-to-day people, to connect with what people need in their lives. So education, health, and livelihoods, you know, and that's business is a huge part of that, and being able to deliver that.
Okay, Mihai, thank you very much for your comments. We really appreciate that. Maybe we'll have a round of applause for Mihai. Thank you very much. Thank you. Our next speaker is Adrian Weeks, who many of you will know. He is Austrade's Senior Trade Commissioner for PNG and the Solomon Islands. He's been involved in the Pacific on Austrade's behalf for many years, and before that was working for, I believe, Tourism Australia in an international role. So, Adrian, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us today. I think a lot of people, you know, there's clearly, I know a lot of people who have an interest in PNG, also have a keen eye on the Solomons. And I imagine at the moment they're feeling a bit out of the loop because they probably haven't been there for a while. So what's your feeling, you know, what exactly is the situation in the Solomons? I think it's only recently reopened. What are business conditions like there? And also, you know, just how much affected by COVID-19 was it?
Yeah, thank you. good to be here and good to talk about Solomon Islands and the Pacific, obviously. That's my broader background. So, and we often see a lot of Australian companies that work across the region. So, not just one market, they will also be very active in other parts of the Pacific, as well. And as you know, we've got like 16 countries. So there's a real choice of business opportunities and markets and partnerships, to be successful in the Pacific. Solomon's, as you said, the border only opened a few weeks ago, 1st of August. It's been closed since that point, so it's been very difficult for any projects to be implemented or developed, particularly from the more complex projects. A lot of smaller projects have been underway, around sort of roadworks and health centres and schools and things like that. But now that the borders are open, there is an opportunity to travel. And it's much easier to move in and out. So we're starting to see projects come back online, particularly the larger projects. There's 3 investment channels basically. There's the multilateral, there's the bilateral, then there's a private investment. So there's a range of projects across those 3 investment streams that are starting to come online. So some of the people that are on the ground are more active now. They've moved beyond the design phase into the implementation phase, and some of those projects, are already underway, particularly around the water sector. Solomon Water have started some of their projects. Some of the roads projects are continued, and now we're starting to see aviation projects for ports and for aviation emerge as well.
Okay, and what's your sense of what the economy's like over there at the moment? I mean, how affected by COVID was it, and what's kind of the kind of mood from people that you've spoken to that are doing business there on a regular basis?
Yeah. So, I mean, COVID had a fairly, small impact because it was closed. It was probably a benefit to the country. Now that it's open, obviously, what I understand, there's a few more COVID cases circulating in the community. So all those protocols around COVID management and COVID operations still retain if you're working and operating there. The people who are doing business are seeing positive signs. The need for trade is critical. But most of this is based around the development projects. So the next probably biggest project, which is well underway but will deliver across many services and infrastructure, is the Pacific Games for next year in 2023. And as I said, Solomon Water has a number of water projects well underway, which they've developed through a combination of international operators, but all of these operators need to have partners to work with. So, of course, it's the partnership that's critical that Mihai talks about in terms of delivery. So all of the meetings that I've seen this year, particularly with the Solomon Islands Chamber of Commerce, and many people here may have been online, they all talk about local content, and that's probably a very common discussion across the Pacific. All governments, just like Australia did when COVID came and the borders were closed, we had to move towards national handling of projects. So we had to use our own local knowledge and capabilities to do this work. And the last 2 years, all these projects have had to work on that basis. Now the borders are open and there's more complex projects that are emerging. They're looking for these partnerships again. And that's what's really critical. And I think it's a common theory that we all speak about, but it's really more true than ever. The need to partnership, the need to provide knowledge transfer systems, and as Mihai said, you must have a social element to your work in the Pacific as well. And Solomon's is no different.
It sounds like people need to get on a plane and get over there and refamiliarise themselves with the market.
Yeah, that's right. Well, it's all about reconnecting, re-engaging. Many people said, "Oh, what's changed since COVID?" And a lot of people think nothing has changed, but a lot has changed. So when we speak to Australian companies about why they do business in the Pacific and what you need to be successful, they all talk about the importance of relationships. Now we know we could say that's a global issue, but I think it's stronger in the Pacific. That face-to-face contact, the importance of these events, of connecting again with your partners or your suppliers, or the projects or government is really, really critical. So getting on the plane and having a solid program is really important at the moment.
And in terms of specific opportunities, I mean, it looks like, if you look at actually Australian investment and involvement in the Solomon's economy currently, the services sector is a particular strength. I mean, obviously ANZ are, very active there. And, there are several other companies there who are, whether it's legal, accounting, those sorts of areas. I mean, that does seem to be a sweet spot for Australian companies in the Solomon Islands.
That's right, yeah. Service has got a long history, but we play well into education as well. Tourism as well as an export service. So that will be slow to pick up, but that will emerge because, there's still a strong interest in that. Education services is one area, but there's still a lot of suppliers, Australian companies. There's over 1,000 companies that engage in the Solomons, and so because of our geography and our strong location, we're quick to be able to supply the market. So we've got very good capabilities, around building construction materials, around food and beverage that move into the Pacific and particularly the Solomon Islands. But more so, it's the Australian capability around engineering and infrastructure that is can be crossed over between many sectors, and that's where a lot of Australia know-how is required in the Solomon Islands.
Yeah, and finally, just to address the point that we discussed with Mihai, what if Australian companies that approach you do have any concerns about the headlines they've read about Solomons recently, what are you telling them?
Yeah. So what we've seen, I guess history can tell us a lot of things, but whenever there's these political issues, the country still needs to function. So, that's delivery of materials, delivery of food, delivery of medicines, and that needs still to find a way to continue. So despite that, I think as Mihai said, you need to be aware of those issues. They're all part of the risk profile when you do business and work out what they are. But the biggest, strongest solution to that is to have a good local partner. Right, because they can help manage you through that environment, can introduce you to the right people, and can look after that risk from a business perspective as well.
Brilliant. Adrian, thank you very much indeed. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Can we have a round of applause for Adrian, please? Much obliged. Well, now you have a little brain break coming up because our next speaker is Daniel Stow, who is the Fiji Trade Commissioner based in Sydney. He covers Australia and New Zealand. He's kindly brought along a nice video to show us, which is going to last about 3 minutes, which will introduce us to the delights of Fiji. Although, from what I gather, I think just about everyone in this room has probably been to Fiji in the last few months or knows someone who has, because I think it's been bursting at the seams. Yes, if we could have that video now, please.
Because the only way for every nation to put itself first is to lock arms with all other nations and move forward together.
Spectacular place we've ever shot Survivor.
Lovely. Thank you very much for that. Okay, so as I mentioned, I think it's a well-known fact that Fiji's tourism industry has bounced back very strongly since reopening. I think it was just before Christmas. But, I do wonder, I think Fiji was very affected by COVID-19 generally. And I wonder, whether that's changed anything fundamentally in the economy and what things are like at the moment in the economy at large.
Yeah, thank you, Robin. Firstly, thank you so much for inviting me to speak today, and Bulawanak, and a very good morning to everyone. Just quickly acknowledge my fellow panellists, Mihai and Adrian. Great to be with you guys as well. Yeah, as you mentioned, Rob, Fiji, like many countries, is now trying to recover from the impacts of the COVID pandemic, something that the Lowy Institute, for instance, has called a lost decade of development. So look, the pandemic punched a hole in the global economy that Fiji, of course, couldn't avoid falling into, and in fact was probably disproportionately affected, I think, in terms of its economic impacts, as was a lot of the Pacific. And as you alluded to, when you have 40% of your GDP that comes from tourism, that goes from literally 0 to 0 overnight, with international travel going into hibernation. Fiji suffered its worst economic downturn in its recorded history of about, I think it was about 15 or 16%. I think you compare that global average, maybe about 2 or 3%, so it gives you an idea. And look, in terms of how that translated on the ground, there was probably around 100,000 people, both directly and indirectly, lost their jobs. And in a country of less than 1 million people, that has very significant impacts and consequences. So, look, there wasn't much for it other than to really try to vaccinate our way out of it, and that was in large part thanks to key partners like Australia, and sort of a silver lining of us not utilising our AstraZeneca vaccines here. They were more than welcome in the Pacific, and Fiji has around, I think, about a 95% fully vaccination rate for its adults, which really was a prerequisite to opening up. We couldn't open up safely until we got those numbers. So yeah, December 1st, we opened up borders to international travel again, and we're expected to see about 500,000 people in Fiji for this calendar year, which is about 50% of what we saw pre-COVID. But no, it's peak season at the moment, and for anyone who's trying to get to Fiji, you'll know some of the struggles of either getting on a plane or getting a hotel room, because the last few months we've been at about 95% numbers of what we had pre-COVID. In terms of what that's translating to economically, we're expected to see about I think 11.5 or 12% increase in GDP this year. So we are seeing that, and that's coming off the back of a very sharp contraction, obviously, but we are seeing that V-shaped recovery rather than a slow U one, which is very promising. Look, I think COVID brought around a lot of changes that perhaps were happening anyway, but it certainly exacerbated, I think, the progress at which that happened, particularly around the theme of economic diversification. And I think COVID certainly underlined the reliance or over-reliance that the economy had on tourism and its vulnerability to those kind of economic shocks. So the government, for instance, put in a number of policies and incentives to attract investment and promote activity in other areas of the economy. For example, agricultural exports exceeded 100 million for the first time in 2020, about 130 million in 2021, and will exceed that again this year. The manufacturing sector, a very well-established sector of the economy, I might add, they had record numbers as well, particularly as a lot of supply chains were brought closer in due to the disruptions. So we saw a lot of Aussie and Kiwi companies try to bring some of their supply chains closer to shore. So we had some big companies like King G, R and Williams, Hard Yakka, New South Wales Police and Fire Services getting their gear made in Fiji. A lot of workwear or sportswear is also made out there, and it's a low cost manufacturing base, about only 3 hours from where we are right now. And one sector in particular that did get a lot of attention was the outsourcing sector, so around ICT, BPO and back office operations. So that sector actually grew from around 3,000 seats pre-COVID to 7,000 during COVID. And again, because people were trying to bring things perhaps more of not necessarily onshoring, but nearshoring, and particularly when we saw contact centres in the Philippines and India really being burnt with COVID not being able to operate. Fiji already had the existing infrastructure, capacity and workforce to absorb that. That's already gone over 10,000 in the last few months, so that's a real promising area for us.
Fantastic. And looking ahead, what are the sort of, what's the Fiji Trade and Invest strategy, say, for the medium term? What's the next step for them? Are there any other opportunities, any other sectors that they are looking to promote, or any other incentives that they're looking to put in place?
Yeah, look, it's a great question. So I note at the start of this month, so 1st of August, the new Investment Act came into play, and really what that's trying to do is streamline the process and make it easier for doing business in Fiji. And as has been alluded to in the past, and not just for Fiji, but in the Pacific, it has been quite difficult sometimes to do business. So now Fiji is not going to make a distinction between whether you're a foreign or a domestic investor. The process will simply be the same. We've also centralised that in one portal, so it's called the BizFiji portal, bizfiji.com. So really, you can go in there, you can register your company name, you can register for tax, and you're essentially ready to go within 48 hours. There's some follow-ups to that, but really what we're trying to do is help streamline that process and make it easier, whether you're a foreign investor or a domestic one for that matter. Look, in terms of where I think there are opportunities and incentives, I'll park tourism for one moment and go back to, so like agriculture, for instance. Fiji has about 25% of its land mass that's actually set aside for commercial agriculture, and really we're trying to help transition from more subsistence-based or wild agriculture to more commercial farming, and I think there's a lot of opportunities for Australian and New Zealand companies to bring that expertise or that capacity building, that machinery and that technology into Fiji to help aid that. For example, Fiji produces, I think, less than 40% of what it consumes in terms of both meat and dairy, so there's a particular opportunity there, for instance, and that's also to help service that domestic market, the tourism industry there, as well as an immediate vicinity of 10 million people within the Pacific, not including then West Coast United States, Australia, New Zealand and the like. Manufacturing is another one as well. We have a number of tax holidays available, I think of up to about 20 years, depending on your level of investment. But really, if you're looking for a cost-effective, near-shore manufacturing alternative, then Fiji really presents itself, I think, in that particular sector. Particularly things like textiles, clothing, and footwear. What you're wearing now. We've had AFL or NRL clubs that needed a quick turnaround time with specific special jerseys, for instance, and you couldn't do that from any other market other than Fiji in both the time and the cost. Outsourcing is, again, probably the one that has the biggest growth potential or the most potential in the market. We can see it grow to potentially around 100,000 people, which would probably see it rival tourism in terms of employment. And we've seen more and more Australian and New Zealand companies relocate back office operations, finance, accounting, HR, call centre, contact centre, whatever it might be, into Fiji. We have a lot of things going for us in that regard. We have a young, educated workforce, 96% literacy rate. We have about 1,000 ICT grads every year out of the 3 universities, including the University of South Pacific, the biggest regional university, 60% of the population under the age of 40, I believe. So, as well as the accompanying infrastructure. We've got first-class telecommunications already set up, so you can come set up your own operations, you can plug into an existing vendor there on the ground. So, yeah, it's probably been a really exciting opportunity to do business in Fiji at the moment.
All right, and final question. You haven't talked much about construction or infrastructure. I mean, Fiji's done a remarkable job of developing its tourism industry. It's the envy of the rest of the Pacific. But presumably now it's looking to, take that. It's probably not going to be resting on its laurels. What about, that sector? What kind of, are there any major projects that maybe are just being talked about or that have been announced that haven't started that, people here might be interested in finding out about?
Yeah, no, great question. I mean, even during COVID, we saw manufacturing, and construction perform quite well during that period. It is something that we have a significant need for in terms of Fiji's overarching development goals. And I think it's key partners like Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, and to an extent, China will certainly play a role in that regard, particularly in things like healthcare, like in hospitals and the like. Also in education, and also just in civil buildings generally. We have a range of incentives that I'd be happy to share with anyone if they are interested, and talk about some specific projects. And then also that's being aided and assisted by some other external funding sources, like the Australian government's Australian Infrastructure Financing Facility for the Pacific, or AIFFP, as I always struggle to remember, as well as a few other ones that it might be worth. So, for whatever reason, we can certainly help navigate through that process and refer people to relevant projects or sources of funding.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Daniel, and I just have remembered that if anyone would, obviously I think everyone knows Adrian pretty well here, but you might not know Daniel so well. If you do want to chat to him more, he's going to be sort of based just next to the registration desk at morning tea. Yep. So, feel free to go and introduce yourself to him if you want to. Can we just have a round of applause for Daniel? Thank you very much. Brilliant. Thank you very much, everybody. Now, normally at this point, we go to the audience for questions, but we decided to do things a bit differently today, so we thought we might ask you some questions to see what happens. I'm seeing a few nervous faces, but actually we've got a couple of people here who I think are from the private sector who do a lot of business all over the Pacific. So I thought I'd just give them a chance to just add their two pennyworth to this discussion. So we might start with Steve Hilliard from Pronto Software. So, they're an IT services provider. They're a significant Pacific concern based in Brisbane. They do business all over the region. So, Steve, you've heard what we've said. I just wonder if you've got if you can add anything for our delegates about what your feel is about what business is like in the Pacific, or maybe in any other markets that we haven't covered.
Thanks, Rob. Certainly, I agree with what Mihai and Adrian and Daniel have said about how we've got to where we are and where we're going to. I think it's worth acknowledging that the Pacific sovereign nations and communities all have diaspora and expat populations in each other and in Australia as a Pacific community too. And there's a desire to do business with each other. We share common legal systems, share common beliefs, share common board, and all of that makes that level of trust and business confidence easier to establish for people. So to find business partners and have similar values is easier to do in the Pacific. So I think that's probably worth acknowledging, and then building those relationships on the back of that, because we all have holidays in each other's countries, and education happens in each other's countries too, and all of those things help to feed that those business opportunities and build that relationship.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Steve. And just finally, we've got George Constantino from the Constantino Group of Companies. They own hotels in Fiji, Solomon Islands, Samoa. I hope I've got that right. So, George, what's your, how's business across the Pacific, and what's the mood like?
Cheers, thanks. No, we actually sold out of the hotel in Fiji. So
my apologies.
No longer there now, but it's good to see the borders opened recently in New Zealand, Solomon Islands, PNG, and obviously in Samoa. What we have done for our Samoan, investment, it's called Tuamasina Island Resort, is we've looked at how Fiji's reopening, and we've tried to understand what's the good and bad points of it. Obviously, they've been very, very, very successful in Fiji. I guess the issue in Samoa is that we've seen it's recently reopened on, I think, the 1st of August, so only a couple of weeks, but the connectivity issues between, I guess, you've got all these hotel rooms ready and everyone's willing to, and was their biggest industry in Samoa, but what we're seeing now is the airplane, the number of seats not increasing, so you had Samoa Airways recently now not operating. You don't have a lot of flights going there, so it's really just from Auckland to Apia. So it's I guess they're trying to manage that at the same level of growth, and that is unfortunately hasn't come across yet. So we're seeing a lot of I guess a lot slower growth in terms of the reopening plan for, I guess, the tourism market in Samoa. So yeah, no, it's at the moment, I guess business confidence isn't great over there, but it is building because it's just obviously they had the measles outbreak in 2019, and then obviously COVID. They had a very, very cautious approach. So obviously only just reopening in 1st of August this year. So yeah, we'll just have to wait and see, I guess.
Thank you very much.
Cheers, thanks.
Andrew, did you have any other questions?
Are there any other questions from the floor? If you raise your hand, I'll get a
We've got
microphone.
time for maybe one more question. Any volunteers?
Oh, there's one over here. Is that right? Yes. Just like to introduce yourself before you ask your question.
Hi, Mihai, Adrian, and Daniel. I'm Sharon from the Devon Policy Center. I've been doing research on Chinese companies in the Pacific, and previously I've been talking to some Chinese companies from Solomon Islands, from Fiji, and they've been telling me about potential cooperation with Australian companies. I know that currently we don't see much cooperation between the two countries. But then from the Chinese point of view, because they know there's a limited market and they are looking for more opportunities, and Australian companies is definitely one of the direction that they want to go into. And they point out to me that they are very interested in cooperation in the green energy, renewable resources, and I think they are planning to potentially having a big investment into Solomon Islands on solar panels and something like that. So I'm just curious, from the Australian perspective, how do you view this perspective of cooperation with Chinese companies, and what's your opinions on the potential directions? Yeah, thank you.
Adrian, would you mind?
Sure. Yeah, thank you for the question. I think there's, there's several investors, obviously, in most Pacific Island countries. Again, we talk about it at the multilateral, the bilateral, and the private level. They're the funding streams. That's what Australian companies follow. The advice that I get from engagement with Australian companies is that they call on a lot of Chinese investment projects that are happening. They talk to them about, supply, for example, capability. They may need to source materials they can't get, say, perhaps from China, or they need to get it from Australia or New Zealand because it's faster, quicker, or there's a standard that they have to work to as well. So a lot of Australian companies tell me that they need to find ways to work with Chinese companies. So I think there is a gradual intent and interest to collaborate. Obviously, when we talk, there's often sometimes a language barrier, so that's something that we probably need to assist with in terms of helping with translation. But I think that on the ground, generally, Australian companies are keen to engage where they can, because at the end of the day, it is about business, and business requires several inputs and certain capabilities as well.